This is the second video in a series of 3 using the black pygmy historical narrative found in Taiwan, Australia and New Zealand to examine how battles over indigenous history can disenfranchise indigenous groups even when attempts are being made to restore their history accurately. This video addresses these topics. 1. Weaponizing archaeology. 2. Weaponizing the Taiwan pygmy myth. 3. Weaponizing the Australian pygmy myth. 4. Weaponizing the New Zealand pygmy myth. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Weaponizing archaeology. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. This famous quotation from George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 is an explicit warning of the power that historical narratives can hold. The academic field of history is obviously vulnerable to subversion by special interest groups, and the field of archaeology in particular has been manipulated regularly by governments over the centuries. In their 2010 article, Constant Resurrection, the Tri-Hybrid Model and the Politicization of Australian Archaeology, Shoshana Grounds and Anne Ross observed that abuse of archaeology, quote, has proven to be a popular nationalistic tool in many situations around the world, end quote, adding, quote, archaeological data have been used to further both positive and negative nationalistic agenda, end quote. Positively, they cite the use of archaeology in the service of, quote, the creation of ethnic identities and nationalistic pride, end quote, and, quote, the understanding of the dignity of all human beings, end quote. Negatively, they cite the use of archaeology, quote, to uphold arguments for intolerance, aggression, and the subjugation of minority groups, end quote. They further write, quote, the use of archaeology to support the superiority of one group over another is not new, end quote, pointing to the use of archaeology in Nazi propaganda as an example. They note that the Nazi regime favored archaeologists whose interpretations, quote, were able to justify Nazi claims to the territorial acquisition of areas external to the contemporary borders of Germany, end quote, providing these archaeologists with greater publicity and financial support. Jan Turek's 2018 article, Archaeopropaganda, The History of Political Engagement in Archaeology in Central Europe, describes how, quote, the official ideology of the Communist Party was applied in Czech archaeology, end quote, and, quote, in the socialistic Czechoslovakia, the phenomenon of Great Moravia was systematically used in the communist propaganda, end quote. Turek explains how the communist government sought to find archaeological evidence justifying a pan-Slavic concept which would identify Czechoslovakia more closely with Russia, noting that some archaeologists, quote, served the regime's propaganda in their interpretation of history and presented to the public a purposely construed picture of the coexistence of two nations which had not even existed in the 9th century at all, end quote. German archaeologist Britta Stein provides Japanese examples of the use of archaeology in service of an imperialist agenda. She notes that during the early 20th century, the Japanese government, quote, recognized the potential that archaeological research had for legitimating its aggressive expansionism on the Eurasian mainland, end quote. As an example, she describes how the excavation of certain tombs in Japan, quote, was forbidden in Japan to avoid conflicts with the written sources and imperial ideology, end quote, while Japanese archaeologists excavated and interpreted the same kind of tombs in Korea, quote, to prove that Korea had been a part of Japan in ancient times, end quote. Stein explains that the Japanese government used archaeology as part of its agenda, quote, to disassociate Japan from the West in a more and more globalized world, end quote, and, quote, to underline the fictional uniqueness of the Japanese people, end quote. This Japanese exceptionalism myth was used to justify imperial expansion into both the Eurasian mainland and the Southeast Asia-Pacific region. The government's political need for ancient Japanese artifacts in order to substantiate its fabricated narrative of antiquity drove some professional archaeologists to fraud. Stein describes how in 2000 it was discovered that leading Paleolithic archaeologist Shinichi Fujimura and his team had, quote, faked archaeological features in 108 cases and had buried much younger Jomon period, 12,000 to 500 BC, objects in Paleolithic layers, end quote. This deception was on an immense scale, apparently starting in the 1970s. Corruption of the archaeological record also occurs frequently in the context of informal and non-academic public discourse. In their articles cited previously, Shoshana Grounds and Anne Ross describe how conspiratorial, quote, New Age theories, end quote, encourage people to believe that, quote, there is some kind of conspiracy by archaeologists or academics to ensure that certain hidden histories do not come to public knowledge, end quote. Such theories, although apparently harmless, can inflict significant damage on indigenous communities. For example, they can have the effect of infantilizing and belittling indigenous people by crediting their achievements and knowledge to otherworldly beings, such as aliens, angels, or demons. The infamous ancient alien conspiracy theory is a case in point. However, Grounds and Ross also warn that, quote, the excitement generated by conspiracy theories may enhance the current popularity of alternative interpretations of the past, end quote, citing surveys indicating that such conspiracy theories prime the public for the reception of revisionist interpretations of archaeology and history which serve a political agenda. They cite the prehistory of Australia as an example, explaining how the general acceptance of relatively benign and even ostensibly positive alternative histories can encourage people to accept less savoury and more damaging politicized accounts of the past. As we shall see, this is particularly relevant to people making good faith attempts to restore what they believe is a lost indigenous history, when in fact they are merely supporting historical distortions which underpin a political anti-indigenous agenda. Weaponizing the Taiwan pygmy myth. Let's now return to Taiwan and examine how the black pygmy genocide narrative has been used to harm indigenous people. For centuries, the indigenous people of Taiwan were suppressed by Chinese and Japanese colonizers. The original Han Chinese colonizers attempted to eliminate the indigenous people through assimilation. Anthropologist John Shepard writes that, quote, confident of the superiority of Chinese culture, end quote, the Han Chinese authorities believed the assimilation of Taiwan's indigenous people was inevitable, quote, as Aborigines came to understand the self-evident superiority of Confucian morality, end quote. Shepard also cites the aims of the Qing dynasty's Taiwan prefect in 1729, which were, quote, not just that Aborigines would become civilized, law-abiding subjects, but that they would be transformed into Han, end quote. The explicit aim of the Han Chinese colonizers was to transform the indigenous people into Han Chinese, annihilating their original culture and identity in the process. Under the Japanese colonial occupation, the same process was followed, only this time with the aim of forcing the indigenous people to adopt Japanese culture by forbidding their language and traditional practices and compelling them to learn Japanese, take Japanese names, and adopt Japanese customs. After Taiwan was invaded by China's nationalist Kuomintang Party in 1949, the Han Chinese colonizers again took up the task of assimilating the indigenous people. One element in this process was simply denying them recognition as indigenous. It was not until the 1980s that this government policy was seriously challenged. Anthropologist Michael Stainton records that when, quote, in December 1984, Aboriginal activists organized the Alliance of Taiwan Aborigines, end quote, the Taiwanese government, which at that time was still the military dictatorship of the Chinese nationalist Kuomintang Party, quote, refused to let the ATA register its publication Yuan Zumin, the Aborigine, because it had an inappropriate title, end quote. He explains that the government took exception to the term Yuan Zumin, meaning indigenous tribes or Aboriginal people, arguing that Taiwan's Aboriginal people could call themselves mountain compatriots, mountain people, high mountain tribes, or Formosan Aborigines, but, quote, not Yuanzumin, Aboriginal people, end quote. He also describes how, in 1988, when, quote, the first Taiwan Aboriginal delegate took part in the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations meeting in Geneva, end quote, the Communist People's Republic of China attempted to force him to change his group's title from, quote, Alliance of Taiwan Aborigines, end quote, to, quote, Alliance of Taiwan Aborigines, Province of China, end quote. The communist government in the People's Republic of China was just as opposed to indigenous rights and identity in Taiwan as the military dictatorship in Taiwan itself. Acknowledging the existence of indigenous Taiwanese people would seriously undermine the PRC's claim that Taiwan was an inseparable part of the historic Chinese Empire and consequently part of Chinese territory. Propaganda from the People's Republic of China insisted that Taiwan's indigenous people were simply Chinese who had migrated there. Consequently, the Chinese Communist government refused to acknowledge the indigenous status of Taiwan's Aboriginal people, calling them Gaoshanzu, or High Mountain people. Stainton quotes a typical example of Chinese historical fabrication from 1991, which claimed, quote, in ancient times, Taiwan was geologically linked to the continental motherland, end quote, and consequently argued that Taiwan's Aboriginal people were not indigenous, but were Chinese, writing, quote, Taiwan is an indivisible part of the territory of the motherland. The Gaoshanzu, High Mountain people, are a member of the great family of the Chinese nation, end quote. In Taiwan itself, the government sought to justify the subordination of Taiwan's Aboriginal people by claiming that they were not truly indigenous. Stainton writes that, quote, a chorus of senior anthropologists, mostly of Chinese rather than Taiwanese origin, end quote, made the case that, quote, the Austronesian inhabitants of Taiwan were only first in order of time, end quote. The government refused to acknowledge the use of the term Yanzumin, indigenous people, arguing that they should be called Xianzumin, first residents, or Daozumin, early residents. As Stainton astutely observes, quote, the implication of this unsuccessful attempt to block use of the term Yanzumin was that no special claims of Aboriginal rights can be made since everyone was an immigrant, end quote. The government's denial of indigenous status to Taiwan's Aboriginal people necessitated a historical narrative displacing them as the original inhabitants. In service of this cynical political agenda, the government's anthropologists turned to indigenous cultural traditions. We now return to the Saishat tribe's oral tradition of the ancient pygmy people exterminated by Saishat ancestors. In the previous video, I explained how the admin of Taiwan's Black Lives Matter Facebook page posted this screenshot from Stainton's article in the academic historical work Taiwan, A New History, 2007 edition. The screenshot quotes Stainton saying this, quote, the anthropologists appealed to the archaeological record that there had been other people in Taiwan since the Paleolithic age, and to the Saishat myth, commemorated in their biennial dwarf sacrifice ritual, that their ancestors had destroyed a race of small people. This putative Negrito race, the anthropologists argued, were the real Aboriginal people of Taiwan, end quote. Having read this page, the admin of Taiwan's Black Lives Matter Facebook page assumed that this book was substantiating the claim that these pygmy people were Taiwan's original inhabitants and that they had been annihilated by Taiwan's current Aboriginal people, who were in fact merely relatively recent immigrants themselves. It is ironic that Stainton is actually saying the complete opposite, that the only reason these anthropologists treated the Saishat oral tradition of pygmy people as historical fact was to help the government deny indigenous status and land rights to Taiwan's true Aboriginal people. If we read on in Stainton's book, we find that Stainton demonstrates this was nothing more than politically motivated historical revisionism without any historical basis. In the third video in this series, I'll explain why the Black Pygmy genocide narrative in Taiwan is false. What's important in the context of this video is that a well-meaning, good faith attempt to defend the history of a supposed Negrito race in Taiwan, the admin of Taiwan's Black Lives Matter Facebook page unwittingly amplified a colonial pseudo-historical narrative which was created specifically to dispossess Taiwan's indigenous people. This demonstrates the danger of outsiders, even those with the best of intentions, meddling in indigenous history they do not truly understand. The weaponization of the Saishat tribe's oral history was immensely useful to Taiwan's Han Chinese colonizer government. Having been constructed in 1991, this pseudo-history was still being appealed to by the government nearly 20 years later. Scott Simon, Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Ottawa in Canada, cites Taiwanese Vice President Annette Lu, herself the descendant of 18th century Chinese immigrants to Taiwan, saying that, quote, Aboriginal people were not the first people in Taiwan, since they were preceded by the black pygmies, Chinese, who later became extinct, end quote. Lu later claimed she had not said this, and that the media had misquoted her. However, a PhD thesis entitled How Han Are Taiwanese Han? Genetic Inference of Plains Indigenous Ancestry Among Taiwanese Han and Its Implications for Taiwan Identity, published in 2008 by Shuzhou Chen of Stanford University, records that in 2007, Lu acknowledged she had made this claim and, quote, apologized to mountain indigenes for her erroneous statement that black pygmies had settled earlier than mountain indigenes in Taiwan, end quote. Chen also noted that at the time of this apology, Lu was standing in front of two maps by Dr. Sim Gan Tek, formerly of National Taipei University, which blurred the distinction between Taiwan's indigenous people and the Han Chinese who immigrated to Taiwan in the 18th century. Chen identifies the political statement this was making, writing, quote, by displaying these two maps, Vice President Lu wanted to persuade mountain indigenes that all the Taiwanese Han are plains indigenes and share the same indigenous ancestors with mountain indigenes, so the conflict between mountain indigenes and Taiwanese Han should be reconciled, end quote. So despite apologizing for having claimed Taiwan's Aboriginal people were not truly indigenous, Lu was now shifting to a new claim that Han Chinese immigrants who arrived in Taiwan thousands of years after the Aboriginal people were just as indigenous as the Aborigines themselves. Again, this was simply another strategy to deny Taiwan's Aboriginal people their unique status as indigenous. This strategy of drawing an equivalence between Han Chinese colonizers and immigrants and Taiwan's Aboriginal people and treating them both as indigenous has unfortunately persisted to the current day. On the 23rd of March 2021, the Taipei Times newspaper reported that on the lead up to International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Taiwan government's Minister without Portfolio, Audrey Tang, claimed that, quote, more than 80% of all Taiwanese might have indigenous ancestry, end quote. Chen Jialin, the article's author, commented, quote, however, Taiwan's outstanding minister was mistaken, a mistake common among the public, end quote. Chen explained that Tang's statement used a popular but false definition of indigenous. Chen cited a UN definition from 1981 which identifies indigenous people as, quote, those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them, end quote. Chen also cited a definition by international law specialist James Anya identifying indigenous people as, quote, the living descendants of pre-invasion inhabitants of lands now dominated by others, end quote. Chen explained that according to these standard definitions, indigenous communities are those, quote, born under colonialism, and it does not refer to any specific ancestry or people who were the earliest to live in a region, end quote. Yet Tang included even Han Chinese colonizers in the category of Taiwan's indigenous people. Consequently, Chen argued Tang's comments failed to differentiate properly between Taiwan's Aboriginal people and the Han Chinese colonizers who came later, creating what Lin referred to as a, quote, sense of homogeneity from the perspective of ancestry, end quote, which, quote, tried to eliminate discrimination simply by emphasizing that we are all the same, end quote. Chen objected to this, writing, quote, that strategy blurs authentic problems such as the oppression and marginalization of Aborigines, end quote. Chen also explained that, quote, the nation's Aborigines only account for 2% of the population, and that 2% refers to communities that are being oppressed within a colonial structure. No matter how many people in the other 98% are shown by scientific evidence to have Aboriginal ancestry or genes, it would not change the fact that this land was colonized and exploited by aggressors in modern times, end quote. Audrey Tang's words are both unfortunate and surprising, given her prominent status as both an anarchist and Taiwan's first transgender and non-binary government minister. Tang, whose Chinese name is Tang Zonghan, or Tang Feng for short, is a prodigy computer programmer recognized as one of Taiwan's top 10 computer experts. At the end of 2005, Tang came out as a trans woman and took the name Audrey Tang. At the time, Tang requested feminine pronouns, but in 2019, they identified as post-gender and announced they are happy with any pronouns people choose to use. As an anarchist, Tang was a participant in the 2014 Sunflower protests, which occupied Taiwan's parliament building, the Legislative Yuan, protesting for greater government transparency. Most recently, Tang was praised widely for their high-tech response to the coronavirus pandemic. As the government's digital minister in 2020, Tang's implementation of open data and government transparency was critical to Taiwan's exceptional containment of the virus. With such a personal background, it is very disappointing that Tang is still perpetuating a government agenda which disenfranchises Taiwan's Aboriginal people and which is still being used to deny them proper recognition as the genuine indigenous inhabitants of the island. Weaponizing the Australian pygmy myth. Now let's turn to Australia, where we'll see the black pygmy genocide narrative has been used to support the same kind of political agenda as in Taiwan. The article by Shoshana Grounds and Anne Ross, cited previously, notes that work in 1941 by Tyndale and Birdsall, quote, proposed that there were 3 waves of Aboriginal migration into Australia over the last 40,000 years, with each migration destroying the previous population and occupying the consequently vacated land, end quote. However, they go on to note that, quote, this model has not been part of any academic archaeology discourse for over 40 years, end quote. As we saw in the first video in this series, this narrative still emerges in both popular and academic discourse. Previously, I cited an article published by Windshuttle and Gillen in 2002, which used this tri-hybrid migration model to argue that Australia's Aboriginal people are not the original inhabitants of the land, but colonizing intruders. But Windshuttle and Gillen's article was not published in a scientific journal. Instead, it was published in Quadrant, a humanities periodical established in 1956, self-described as classical liberal, which is a red flag by itself, with a very well-established record of decades of conservative, anti-progressive, and reactionary content. Grounds and Ross observed that the tri-hybrid migration model is appealed to by writers such as Windshuttle and Gillen, quote, because it suits their own political agenda, end quote, adding, quote, many members of the wider Australian public continue to embrace this outdated theory, end quote. Grounds and Ross further note that Windshuttle and Gillen claim Birdsall's tri-hybrid model, quote, has been systematically hidden from the Australian public, end quote, and replaced with a history, quote, denying the existence of preceding waves of Indigenous people who were either decimated or exiled to remote pockets of the Australian continent by subsequent Indigenous settlers, end quote. Although their article is the most commonly cited source for this pseudo-history, Windshuttle and Gillen are not the only source. Citing the book Cape York, The Savage Frontier, self-published by the author Rodney Liddell in 1991, Grounds and Ross describe Liddell's claim that the original inhabitants of Australia were Papuans, who were annihilated by a later group of immigrants to Australia from India, and that Australia's Aboriginal people, quote, arrived on the Australian continent less than 400 years ago, end quote. The political implications of accepting this false narrative are obvious. As in Taiwan, this narrative has been used to argue that the Australian Aboriginals are not the original inhabitants, are consequently not indigenous, and are therefore not entitled to the status and land rights of indigenous people. Grounds and Ross quote Liddell's incendiary language describing the Australian Aboriginals as, quote, Australoid invaders, end quote, whose, quote, murderous behaviour, end quote, wiped out Australia's original inhabitants. They also cite Liddell's view that land rights for Australian Aboriginals are, quote, ludicrous, end quote. Writing in the online magazine Indigenous X, Aboriginal Australian and Wurlama woman Claire Coleman points out that once this argument is taken seriously, the English colonisers become, quote, merely the most recent arrivals of multiple overlapping invasions, end quote, and consequently Australia's Aboriginal people, quote, are not deserving of land rights because we invaded someone else. The people here before are the ones deserving of land rights, but they are all dead, end quote. Coleman also notes how this false narrative has entered the public consciousness, noting that, quote, it is not uncommon to read or hear the arguments, Aborigines took the continent from the pygmies, or Aboriginals were not the first people in Australia, end quote, especially in response to Aboriginal rights activism. She goes on to note such comments are, quote, almost always stated without references, end quote, and that if a reference is given, quote, it is usually the same document, an article in Quadrant by Keith Winshuttle and Tim Gillen called The Extinction of the Australian Pygmies, end quote. Examples of this pseudo-history being weaponized by the public are easy to find. The Courier Mail, a newspaper published in the Australian state of Queensland, is a depressingly reliable source of conservative, reactionary, anti-progressive, misogynist, and openly racist content. Unsurprisingly, it has been a source of particularly bigoted comment on this particular subject. Ian McNiven and Lynette Russell's 2005 book, Appropriated Pasts, Indigenous Peoples and the Colonial Culture of Archaeology, quote a letter to the Courier Mail published on the 5th of January 1988, in which a reader identified as Aaron Joint objected to the idea that the Aboriginal people were Australia's original inhabitants. In his letter, Joint wrote, quote, the original inhabitants were the Negritos, a pygmy Asian, a fact proved by archaeologists. Funnily enough, of the remains found, many had the rear of the skull caved in, as though bashed from behind. The Negritos were wiped out by a bigger people who wouldn't face them. I wonder who those people were, end quote. McNiven and Russell also note that 8 days later, a letter from Leon Satterthwaite, an anthropologist at the University of Queensland, wrote his own letter to the Courier Mail, systematically demolishing Joint's claims. McNiven and Russell say Satterthwaite not only, quote, pointed out the smashed skull evidence was nonsense, end quote, but also correctly identified Joint's appeal to the black pygmy genocide narrative as, quote, a convenient scientific justification for the European displacement of Aboriginal people, end quote, on the basis that, quote, European appropriation of Aboriginal land can be rationalized as simply another phase in an inevitable historical process, end quote. Nevertheless, McNiven and Russell also observe that in addition to publishing this letter from a professional anthropologist, on the same day the Courier Mail published yet another letter from a member of the public which made exactly the same spurious claims as Joint, saying, quote, claims for land rights and reparations are based on the false premise that the Aborigines were the original owners of Australia. The tragic demise of the Negritos attests to the Aboriginal presence being evidence of occupation rather than title, end quote. The fact that these letters were written as early as 1988 shows just how quickly the false narrative of Australia's settlement had become weaponized and filtered into the public consciousness. The fact that this pseudo-history was still being promoted decades later by articles such as Winshuttle and Gillen's in 2002 shows how pervasive and persistent it is. Incredibly, this claim is still being made even in the highest levels of Australian government. As recently as 2015, Senator David Leyonhjelm, a self-described libertarian, objected to the wording of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples Sunset Extension Bill 2015, which formally identified the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as Australia's first inhabitants. Dismissing the established scholarly consensus that the Australian Aborigines are both Australia's original population and its indigenous people, Leyonhjelm claimed, quote, "This is conjecture. Archaeologists make extraordinary discoveries all the time, and one of those discoveries could be that someone made it to Australia before the Aborigines," end quote. Although he did not cite the black pygmy genocide myth directly, it is clear that such a theory was certainly behind his comments. This was made even more obvious when he said, quote, "It is likely that some Aboriginal people do not have a relationship with traditional lands and waters," end quote. So despite the fact that it's a long debunked anthropological interpretation, typically only supported today by conservatives, reactionaries, anti-progressives, and downright racists, the black pygmy genocide myth in Australia still has the potential for genuine harm to Australian Aboriginals, both socio-culturally and legally. Weaponizing the New Zealand pygmy myth. Finally, we return to New Zealand. By this time, it should come as no surprise that in New Zealand also, as in Taiwan and Australia, this narrative has been weaponized in attempts to deny Aotearoa's Aboriginal people, the Maori, their true status as both indigenous and the original inhabitants of the land. Writing in the online magazine The Spin-Off, Dr. Kerry Mills of the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand poses the question, quote, "Why do so many people believe the Moriori were a pre-Maori people living in Aotearoa that were wiped out by the Maori?" End quote, before supplying the answer that, quote, "This story was taught as history in New Zealand schools for most of the 20th century," end quote. However, Mills also says that, quote, "This doesn't fully explain the story's pervasiveness," end quote. She notes that the story was partly dismantled in the 1920s and that as long ago as 1976, ethnologist David Simmons, quote, "meticulously debunked," end quote, the entire narrative. Mills cites historian Kerry Howe explaining that the Moriori myth was used very early by European colonizers, quote, "to justify what they saw as the imminent extinction of Maori and excuse themselves from blame for it," end quote, arguing, quote, "The story of the extinction of Moriori at the hands of Maori was another example of a natural process of a stronger race replacing a weaker one," end quote. As Howe describes it, once the colonizers had interpreted the Moriori's destruction at the hands of the Maori as part of a natural evolutionary process, it was easy to justify the Maori's displacement and elimination at the hands of Europeans as simply another instance of this same natural process. Naturally, this narrative was preserved by the colonizers, and despite academic refutations, it remained well embedded in the public consciousness. Mills cites the typical script, saying, quote, "You've heard it before. There were a pre-Maori people in New Zealand called the Moriori. When Maori arrived in the country, they set about obliterating these peaceful Moriori inhabitants until not a single Moriori remained alive," end quote. This narrative was then used to validate ignoring Maori calls for restorative justice. Consequently, Peter Clayworth notes, quote, "Whenever there was mention of the idea that the Maoris might have some justifiable complaint over Pakeha taking their land, the standard reply was, 'But they took it off the Morioris first,' end quote." Clayworth also provides details of the typical narrative which demonstrate it was virtually identical to the same narrative found in Taiwan and Australia, writing, quote, "The Morioris were generally portrayed as a much darker and more primitive group than the Maoris, who had been in occupation of New Zealand until the Maori came and ate them," end quote. Clayworth explains how this was used as an apologetic for the European invaders of Aotearoa, who, so the colonizer narrative claimed, quote, may have done some bad things in their takeover of New Zealand, end quote, but, quote, had treated the Maori better than the Maori had treated the Moriori, end quote. Clayworth also identifies the black pygmy genocide myth being used in defense of the argument that, quote, the Maori were not the real natives of New Zealand anyway, end quote, and that they should subsequently not be deemed its original inhabitants. So, in New Zealand, the myth was used to justify European colonization and to disparage the Maori people as warfaring savages who had not only invaded the territory of the original indigenous people, but who also committed atrocities against them and who therefore deserved to be displaced. But the Moriori extermination narrative was also used in another way, which was arguably even more destructive. Ironically, it was used by certain Maori iwi, or tribes, themselves to justify their own entitlement to the land they had taken from the Moriori. Subsequent to the massacre of the Moriori, their numbers, now perilously low, continued to diminish dramatically as a result of enslavement and forced assimilation by the Maori tribes which had invaded them. By the 1860s, barely 100 Moriori still survived. A High Court ruling by Judge David Collins in 2018 records the complicated history of legal title over the Chatham Islands, originally occupied by the Moriori. Collins describes how in 1870 the Colonial Native Land Court awarded 97.3% of the captured land to the Maoris who had taken it on the grounds that they had acquired it by conquest in 1835. Collins also notes that just 2.7% of the land was awarded to the surviving Moriori. Moriori numbers continued to dwindle over time to the extent that the New Zealand government eventually declared them extinct. At this point, the only legal claim on the conquered land remained in the hands of the Maori tribes which had invaded. However, Collins states that in 1988, a Moriori descendant of mixed ancestry filed a claim on the land, quote, on behalf of all Moriori, end quote. This was met with direct opposition by the Ngāti Mutunga, one of the Maori tribes which had committed the Moriori massacre. According to Collins, this tribe, quote, unsuccessfully sought an injunction to try and stop the Waitangi Tribunal hearing the claim lodged by Mr. Solomon, end quote. This legal dispute placed the modern New Zealand settler government in the unusual situation of having to adjudicate between two indigenous groups over a land title dispute resulting from the invasion and conquest of one tribe over another. Whereas Solomon, representing the Moriori, claimed the land for the Moriori people on the basis of traditional ancestral ownership, the Ngāti Mutunga claimed the land on the basis of the right of conquest, appealing to their own customs. With both groups appealing to indigenous traditions in order to justify their land claim, there was clearly no easy answer. It was also a controversial political issue, since awarding the land to the Ngāti Mutunga would tacitly endorse the concept of territorial acquisition by military conquest and extermination, which is exactly what the European colonizers had done to the Maori themselves. A ruling that conquest extinguished native land title would be extremely awkward, and may have had legal implications for Maori land claims on the New Zealand government. The subsequent legal history is complex, and I have no legal background whatsoever, so I will summarize the key events in the dispute from Collins' record without making any attempt to interpret them myself, and omitting minor technical details of the legal arguments which are irrelevant to the overall narrative. Collins' ruling can be found in my list of sources and is freely available online for anyone who wants to read all 30 pages in full. Collins says that in 2001, the Waitangi Tribunal, a government commission of inquiry which receives and addresses indigenous rights claims, ruled that, quote, conquest was insufficient on its own to create and destroy customary title, end quote. Consequently, the land in question was awarded to Solomon on behalf of the Moriori trust he represented. However, the dispute did not end there. Collins noted that the Waitangi Tribunal's findings were rejected by Ngāti Mutunga. Subsequently, in 2017, the tribe appealed to the New Zealand government, again claiming the territory on the basis of their conquest of the Moriori. In 2018, Collins ruled on the issue in favour of the Moriori Trust, concluding that the Ngāti Mutunga had failed to satisfy the requirements of Sections 18, 20 and 21 of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, to which it had appealed. Nevertheless, this was still not the end of the issue. In 2019, when the settlement in favour of the Moriori Trust was to be finalised, the Ngāti Mutunga filed an injunction attempting to prevent it. However, as reported by Maori News Director Manny Dunlop in August 2019, the New Zealand High Court rejected the injunction and the settlement was finalised. In her article, Dunlop noted that Moriori leaders, quote, hope it gets rid of the myths colonisation has caused to their people, end quote. The complex and tortured history of the Moriori people demonstrates how colonial tropes and myths can be weaponized not only by colonizers against indigenous people, but also by indigenous people themselves against other Aboriginal groups. Conclusion. This video has demonstrated how archaeology and history can be weaponized in service of oppressive political agendas by imperialists, colonizers, and even indigenous people. It has also demonstrated how well-meaning attempts to interpret indigenous history can unwittingly fall victim to supporting false narratives which validate and uphold colonizer-settler power structures and disenfranchise indigenous people. It has also demonstrated just how complex indigenous history can be, especially when approached from the perspective of an outsider. All around the world, indigenous people are being repressed, oppressed, disenfranchised, and dispossessed. However, there are very rarely simple solutions to these problems, and the most apparently effective approaches often turn out to be, counterintuitively, the most unhelpful. Frequently, the issues appear transparently clear and straightforward, when in actual fact, they are hopelessly messy and entangled. In the final video in this series, we will look at how to debunk the black pygmy myth in Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, unravelling the false claims and identifying the reliable sources which correct the historical record.